Chapter: The Names of Trees. Frances stumbled back into Pophiem's room, the door slamming behind, and she was vaguely annoyed to see him again. She had her own thoughts to process, and she didn't want to have to deal with anyone else's feelings. She simply looked at him from the bed where she was propped up against two pillows. Frances hadn't expected fawning concern, but this felt cold even for her. His shoulder ached from the strange position he slept in last night and the rough treatment this morning. He walked over to the chaise lounge. Lying down, he wouldn't have to look at her. They sat in silence for some time. Finally, Pophiem sighed. "So you're mad at me?" "No," Frances replied honestly. "You have no right to be angry." "I've the same right as you do, but I said I'm not angry." "I don't believe you. I would be angry with me." "Anger doesn't come easily. It's different now after all those years in the woods. The word anger is like calling a tree a tree." "Is a tree a tree?" "Yes, but it's not very helpful for differentiation, specificity. So many different kinds of leaves, needles, saps, and sizes. There must be 1,000 different species of anger." "But they're all still trees," Pophiem countered snarkily. "Or none of them are. I'm not denying the utility of shorthand. I'm saying I'm not angry in the broad sense." "Okay," she sighed again, realizing talking about his feelings was allowing distance from being forced to confront her own. "So if you were going to be specific, what would you call your feeling?" Frances thought for a moment. "Disappointment, maybe, but not because I expected anything, so maybe that's not right." "God," Pophiem laughed. "You're not angry, just disappointed. Haven't heard that one for many moons. My mother said that when I got into trouble with the street kids. They knew all kinds of little tricks that the kids I grew up with didn't." "There's no good name for it, my feeling," Frances continued. "We have better names for trees than feelings." It was odd to think about, having more names for plants in his head than feelings. He could rattle off 100 plant names right now. "Well, that's the difference between studying magic and Druidism or whatever it is you call your study. We have self-knowledge." Pophiem stood up from the bed and took a lid off a small keg and ladled herself water into a teapot. She took a black disc out of a drawer, and it flamed up and hummed red on a ceramic plate. She placed the elevated teapot base over the top of the hot disc. "I think you're angry, but you have no right to it, so you're frustrated. A frustrated druid stuck in a room when he could be out in the dirt eating some slimy mushroom. And now you're insulting me. You're the one who's angry and frustrated and disappointed. You're disappointed in yourself for the depths of disgust you have to allow to get what you want," Frances accused. "The little druid can't name his own feelings, but now he's got me all figured out," Pophiem spat back. Frances thought about standing up and slapping her. It was strange. The impulse felt like it came from a place of affection. What was that tree called? Passion? Instead, he complained about his shoulder and laid fully onto his back, looking at the white tiles and brown grouting on the ceiling glowing in the lamplight. When the tea was ready, she poured herself a cup and offered him none and sat down at her desk with her back to him. Pophiem knew she had been wrong to lash out, but there was nothing she could do about being wrong now. Move forward. What was he to her anyway? He hadn't done anything for her. When was the last time she had been taken care of by anyone? Maybe she could still use him. Maybe it was time to leave. Her distraction had already gotten out of hand. She'd need her supply of atheramite, but where would they live? In the woods? She couldn't go back to the king. Well, maybe she could, with the right magical words. Frances was beginning to doubt what he'd said before about there being hundreds of different variations on anger. Perhaps feelings manifested in different people differently, but maybe there wasn't so many, ultimately. He tried listing them in his head. Happy, sad, angry, horny, curious, bored. Could all feeling be summed up into 6 words? That didn't seem right either, but all the other words he could think of were some variation of these 6. He shifted his position, lying down, and a jolt of pain ran up the back of his neck. Oh yes, he'd forgotten hurt. Physical pain. Suffering. And again he was thinking about himself, the unfamiliar familiarity of suffering. It felt new every time, like the new injury had to process the suffering differently, and yet suffering was the same, so much like other pains he'd felt in the past. Maybe there were only these 7 feelings, but one experienced them at different stages of life, and so were processed differently. Anger at 14 felt different from anger at 18, 21, 25, 30, however long one lived. That was what one called wisdom, the having felt something many times already, the knowledge of the previous coloring the feeling. Now, that did add complexity. He was half pleased with this new theory. The positive thing about suffering was it increased empathy in his thinking, even if it was only empathy for himself. He thought about telling the idea about feelings to Popheme, but to do so felt frivolous. She would call it speculative and dismiss him. Then again, maybe not. Maybe what he was feeling now was shame. Ah! He'd forgotten shame. Shame and loathing. Pity. Why did he feel shame? His lack of agency. There was something strange about this shame, though, like it was the opposite of what he was supposed to be feeling. He recalled another line from an esoteric tome on Mellowland's shelves. The opposite is most appropriate for the shame of the gods. He remembered reading that line over and over. It was about how in 2 identical plants one might be poison. But it also meant something else, something more metaphorical and cryptic and feeling. It was a book about the secrets of nature, how and why plants disguise themselves as others. Everything that is profound likes masks. Another line from that same page. Francis distinctly remembered, sitting there by the fire and reading this same page over and over. He still wasn't sure he understood. He didn't think he wore a mask, but then again, he didn't think of himself as profound. He felt the opposite of profound. Although his shoulder hurt and life seemed grim, there was an escape hatch in his head. He'd already accepted his own death. Every day, every minute after acceptance had been gravy. Extra. Meant to be savored. Though most people didn't savor their gravy, for most it was considered essential. The essential extra. A proper phrase to describe life itself. When he thought of things this way, he was as a god, timeless. Popheme wanted to buy more time, with this baby, with power, but Francis was pretty sure that's not how time or gods worked. Everything was eternal. As long as there were creatures who walked or crawled and the sun shone, he was present in life, somewhere. Still, Francis the man was not yet absent, and the quandary of shame ever present. Even lying here, utterly disrespected, imprisoned, he wanted to make Popheme happy, if only because she was the only person who could even pretend to care about his well-being. Francis was raised to be a people-pleaser. That had been another reason for his retreat from society. He was always distracted by other people's feelings, making sure they were happy, or at least not distressed. When he was alone, he finally got to know himself, and he chased that feeling of freedom to be himself right to Mellowland's stoop. What a stroke of luck Mellowland had been. He'd been grateful to his friend many, many times, but never more so than right now, in this moment. After they got to know each other, they had a good 6 years, the best of his life. Yes, gratitude was the counter to shame. Out in the woods, starving, angry with oneself for not planning ahead, ashamed and dejected, and then there it was, a patch of yarrow and a flood of gratitude. Not that he'd ever been truly starving. Starving was for those trapped by society, waiting for benevolence from a ruling class who thought of them like donkeys. Donkeys. And he was thinking then about the sad eyes of the donkeys who pulled the sleds up the incline in the mountain. How would you make that kind of donkey happy? A little green field. How could he make her happy? Much more challenging. After this much silence, he now felt like he could say anything at all, and the more random it was, the better. One becomes so concerned with who they're becoming, they forget who they have been. Becoming is hard. Being is easy, and to have been is to be, Francis said with a lofty, pretentious air, staring up at the ceiling and not averting his eyes when she turned around to look at him. Popheme almost wanted to be amused. She couldn't allow herself to be. Then again, there was a glimmer of affection. She realized she was upset he wasn't mad at her. Being mad at her would have proven he cared, and his not being mad showed he didn't give a damn what happened to her. He should have been pounding on the door when that brute was inside her, though she would have hated that too, of course. How would his protests have helped? Let her get on with it and pull her little strings. She turned and stared at the scraggly, bearded face somehow fascinated with the ceiling. He felt eyes on him for a long while before he acquiesced and turned. Popheme was trying to see what he was, deep inside. Or at least she was pretending that's what she was doing. She was trying to move past the point of feelings now. She'd set a course of action. Feelings were inevitable, but they were to be parried. The tired look in Francis's eyes glanced off her easily. I dabbled in hermeticism myself, you know. The problem, I realized, the difference between me and hermits is they seem to believe they can recreate the same happiness over and over. They never need anything else. If you think that, you're either a liar or insane, or maybe you've done something so unforgivable the weight in your mind is crippling. Which do you think you are? She asked, thrusting against the parry of her potential pity. Francis didn't hesitate. A liar. Counter parry. She'd temporarily forgotten he did have some training. It's funny, Francis continued. I had this conversation on the trip here, with Spliff. He didn't believe me. Here's a question. Can a liar tell the truth about themselves? Popheme waited for an answer to this obviously rhetorical question. They looked at each other like duelists, and then Francis's shoulder hurt again, and he grimaced in pain. She reluctantly stood and opened her chest of herbs and withdrew a jar and mixed him a cup of tea with a tiny sprinkle of atheromite and a dash of brandy. She brought it over and said it was for the pain. She unwound his bandage and redressed the wound to stave off infection. This was all practical activity, and she reassured herself she felt nothing. And what will you do now? Popheme asked dispassionately. Francis wondered that himself. Just then the door to the room opened. The female gnome servant Francis had seen many times bringing Popheme their meals walked in with a tray of hard bread and hard cheeses and what appeared to be a jar of assorted pickled vegetables. She was distressed and immediately informed Popheme what was happening with the other humans. Popheme listened, trying not to roll her eyes. After the information was exchanged and Popheme was processing while eating a piece of bread and cheese, Francis whispered, How many are guarding the door? Out there. The gnome servant looked at him, slightly surprised. She'd just explained how they'd all ascended to the feast table upstairs. Francis walked over to the door and peeked his head outside. It was true. The hallway was empty. Francis turned back, puzzled, trying to figure out if there was any possible way this was some elaborate trap. Suddenly he felt very hungry and went to the platter and ate voraciously, making Popheme scowl. With his mouth crammed full, he walked back to the door and looked again. Well, Francis mumbled, his mouth still full. He went back to the small table for the last half of his tea and drank it down. I think it's time for me to leave. Popheme felt a straight jolt of fear at being left alone, though she hid it well. She said nothing to give nothing away. She was past feelings now. They would only distract. The atheromite helped her to stay focused on the future. Francis gulped down a couple more slices of pickled beet and a pickled pepper and began walking to the door. A tingle in his brain made him stop and turn and say a very impractical thing. It's true that like trees share their looks with other trees, I share all the similarities of a liar. Everyone would say so. And yet I am not one. You are the opposite. You share no similarities, and no one would guess, and yet you are one. How odd." He walked out the door before she had a chance to respond. She didn't let herself feel sad or angry. Dispassionately, Popheme thought. Francis might have been the only man ever capable of truly understanding her. And if she ever saw him again, there was a good chance she'd have to kill him. Chapter: Unleash the Snobs! It was a known secret that Councillor Irondine's 3 daughters were the gnomes with the most power in Ionata. Their home was the opposite of Falcior's mansion, which in the years before he'd arrived had been called the Glass House, and was reserved for entertainments of many kinds. The Iondine home looked austere from the street, but underneath was an opulent sophistication of granite block and gold-patterned rooms. 3 generations previous, their great-grandfather had overseen the construction of the glass dome and had done so with a cruel heart. The Iondine leadership/personality was feared and respected. The criteria for becoming a helper at the Iondine house was very strict, although the rules were nebulous and fluid and depended on moods. All gnomes who were let go to return to their other lives were given generous gifts and encouraged in their endeavors. One might say the moods were planned, a generational blueprint about creating an aura of power through intimidation and selective generosity. Many gnomes traced their position in the dome to a stint working in the Iondine sophistication, as the house was called, though emotional labyrinth would have been more accurate. The eldest daughter, Connexia, was particularly notorious for her moods and firings. She felt there was a strange paradox getting to know another gnome. The closer you got to understanding them, the less sense they made. She felt this most strongly about her father, who she wished would just die already. She knew every detail of his habits, down to the minute, and wasn't sure he was alive in the literal sense, like he might be one of those automata in the great lore of gnomish culture. Connexia found his predictability frustrating because she hated her own predictability. She had no real options in life, so she felt, in the obligation to her status. Her only real recourse to feeling was meanness, and even this she found distasteful. She was quietly hoping this new insurrection would finally allow her to run things how she saw fit. Stitch everything together more closely, like the fittings of the glass which constituted the dome. She went up every afternoon to look at the dome with binoculars, to marvel that no new cracks had formed that day. The middle daughter, Alenza, was getting massage. She saw no reason to break her routine because some humans were quarreling, though on this particular day she had to share the spa room with 3 small children and their mother, who was trying to keep her mind off things by obsessively giving all her children baths. Haida liked the spa room because it had a series of mirrors from upstairs, reflecting down natural light. Keppo had hurried them all over to this strangely musty room in the dead of night, their own home having no real protections from a horde of human attacks. The sophistication had a heavy metal plate over the stairs. Haida didn't know what to do but worry, and the quiet light and gold overlays of waterfalls on the spa room walls seemed to be the only thing keeping her sane. She was not aware there were 2 reasons she was brought here. That her spouse was also having an emotional affair with the youngest daughter, Potentia. Keppo had defined his role as being on watch with Potentia. They were in the office/library taking turns looking through the 2 periscopes, which viewed cross-sections of the upper street. The main point of concern being if anyone tried to come or go through Falcior's. Iondine the Elder had also joined them. He was gently nodding off in the corner, taking the well-deserved rest of a gnome who'd raised 3 daughters to be the best. It was hard for Keppo. He really wanted to press his face right next to Potty's face. She understood him. It was a dynamic of the utmost cliché. For the past year, they would steal off to a corner of the dome together, or finally get outside the mountain and go for walks by the fields. Keppo had a lot to say about his energies and his plans and his dynamic with Haida, who seemed like she hated him most days. Hated him more days than she liked him. Potencia happily listened. Did she do so almost entirely for political reasons? Yes. But it wouldn't be fair to say she wasn't at least curious about Keppo. This odd gnome who had gone from an average working gnome to the highest position in the social hierarchy. She both respected and vaguely resented him, a jealous resentment, and felt she would very much benefit from gathering his secrets. Under her quiet and demure demeanor was an ambition she herself barely understood. Though it could be said part of it was being born the youngest in a reaction to her oldest sister's tight grip on the family politics. "But what can we do?" Potencia Whisper asked Keppo, keeping her voice down, trying not to attract one of her father's random tirades which made no sense. Keppo removed his eye from one periscope to look in Potty's eye. He had no better answer than she did. Still, he felt mildly giddy, getting this excuse to be in the same room together. He recalled stories told about kings and their hounds who would chase down the villains trying to overthrow them, and through a random series of connections inside his brain, giddy with love, he whispered loudly, "Unleash the snobs!" Potencia giggled. They'd often joked about the gnomes in Ionata, the snobs who thought they had so much power. Then she had to get serious again. She wanted to be one step ahead of Connexia. "We can't just wait down here," she said with the angst of a teenage gnome. Keppo was sympathetic. Then again, there was hardly a better place to be in all Ionata, other than the fact that the thermite lighting didn't work anymore. But even that, the shadows and the candlelight reminded him of his childhood and the intimacy of spooky nights. In a way, now, he was grateful Spliff had made his chaos come to be. "I know Falcior. If we wait them out, he'll find some way to make a deal," he said reassuringly. "Isn't all of this his fault?" Potencia replied. "Why give him the satisfaction? You've told me yourself Ionata doesn't need him." Keppo glanced furtively over the mostly deaf elderly patriarch. He knew logically the old man couldn't or wouldn't do anything, but he was representative of giving away a secret. Keppo had never even told Haida the truth about a thermite. "I don't think he's so bad." "How do you know he isn't in on it?" "Because nothing happened until Spliff returned. It's his fault," Keppo said. Potencia walked closer to Keppo, whispering, "I think it's time a gnome was back in charge, don't you? What did the humans do other than pretend? Sure, they got all gnomes to agree and let something change. Hard enough to do normally, but that moment has passed. You know it too. The only way we'll clean up this mess is gnomes coming together." Keppo was certain she was right, especially looking into those wide, earnest eyes. He wanted to be a leader for her, but he wasn't sure he was capable. He'd been around Falcior. Keppo knew putting on the airs of authority was not so easily done. One couldn't just change their personality like a new set of clothes. He looked away from her and into the periscope. "I think it should be you." He couldn't look at her when he said this. Perhaps because some part of him was afraid of seeing the flare of ambitious desire such a compliment might bring, or the look of pity for a sycophant like him to suggest it. Potencia was thrilled by the suggestion. She already had the sense she was special, but this was a confirmation. None is more tantalized and ruined by the suggestion of their genius than the young. But before she could do much more than smile down at her sandals and feel the tickle of glory, Keppo swore under his breath and waved his hand for her to look through the other periscope. She shuffled quickly back, and once her eye was adjusted, she witnessed the rush of humans charging out the wide-open front doors of the mansion. A couple threw canisters into the contingent gnome guard behind their makeshift barricade, and smoke drifted in front of the glass viewer. As soon as the smoke dissipated, Potencia had to witness the awful slaughter of the guard. They'd stationed far too few since the events of the evening. They'd assumed a standoff would last days, and all the gnomes who'd rallied and stayed up all night had burned out emotionally and returned to their homes to recuperate. The last of the guard threw down their arms and held up their hands in surrender. The humans were taken over with an animal bloodlust, which had been warned to all gnomes since childhood. They killed the defenseless gnomes and raised their swords in celebration. Potentia had already removed her eye from the periscope before Keppo turned, witnessing the look of horror on her face. She rushed out of the small room and Keppo gave chase. "Where are you going?" he asked desperately. Potentia did not answer. Her head was screaming the words, "I told you we should have done something." They were quickly in the main living area where Connexia and her assistant were sitting in 2 large chairs covered in white fur. Connexia looked up from her reading, the furiously thinking look on her sister's face already making her tired, and the pathetic male chasing after her. She always knew there was something off about Keppo, a little slow in the head. She never could quite fathom what preposterous series of events had led to his new station. Potentia was pacing, repeating, "They killed them! They killed them!" "So what happened?" Connexia asked Keppo. He explained that the humans had come out, had killed the guard, and were now loose in the streets. "Well, they're not getting in here," Connexia replied coldly, returning to her reading. This made Potentia even somehow more distressed, and she bolted for the door on the other side of the room. Keppo followed quickly. They walked down a short hallway, and she entered a small door, letting it close behind her before Keppo could reach. He opened the door to find a small pantry of dry goods. Potentia was reaching behind a sack of ground barley. "What are you doing?" Keppo asked to no reply. Potentia grumbled, and then there was a loud click. She sighed and began now pushing on the shelves, which started to groan open slowly. Wait! Keppo grabbed her arm. Potentia shook him off and stared him down in a look of defiance. "We have to warn the others," she said, her heart filled with glory. Who? Who are we going to tell?" This made Potentia pause and think. "We'll get down to the slope. That's where they were marshalling reinforcements." Keppo ignored the fact he didn't understand what the word marshalling meant. "They'll figure it out. How do you know you can get to them first?" "Because I know these streets," Potentia said. Finally seeing the fear in Keppo's eyes, Potentia said, "You don't have to come with me." Keppo, to his credit, was thinking about his children. Potentia could not work through his hesitancy with him. She continued to exert herself against the secret door until the ladder up was fully revealed. "It's okay," she said almost sweetly. She didn't need him now. She kissed him on the cheek and began ascending the ladder. Keppo swore under his breath and followed her up. At the top of the ladder, Potentia cranked a small handle which retracted a metal plate into the wall. No light was revealed until she stuck her hand up and pushed aside another wood plank. Finally, she scampered through. After Keppo followed her, she reached down gently and pressed on the plate, releasing a spring mechanism slicing it shut. She replaced the wood plank, and Keppo noticed they were at the first of 3 oddly perfect planks spaced inside a narrow alleyway, bricked on all sides. Potentia squatted next to a lower section near the corner of the wall and pushed open a small square of bricks. She gave him a hurry-along gesture, and they crawled on all fours into the side street. Keppo again wanted to hold her back, but he was totally disoriented and had to trust her directional sense. They went in the opposite direction of the rumblings of the humans. Keppo was finally oriented when he saw the curve to the road and realized they were taking the long way around the outside. Not only was this not faster, but it didn't feel particularly more safe since the road was obvious. Potentia started yelling, "They're out! They're out! The humans are attacking!" She was waving her arms for unknowable reasons, and Keppo trotted after nervously, soon shushing her. Their position was too vulnerable. She did not listen. Finally, Keppo had to shout at her, "Hey, don't you think there's a reason we're the only ones out here?" This finally did give Potentia pause. And though she didn't want to acknowledge it, she realized he might be right and they should focus their efforts on getting to the slope. She stopped yelling and their trot turned into a jog. Soon they could hear human voices coming up a side street in their direction. Luckily, their small stature made quiet footfalls on the dirt and gravel road, but they could only conclude that they were being hunted. At a fast run, they were coming around a corner to the market. From here it was only a short ways to the entrance and down the slope, but the ground would be unprotected. They would be visible to anyone already in the market. They hid behind a canvas back wall of a tent and readied their courage. They could hear voices and expected a chase. Keppo looked into Potencia's wide eyes, which were misty with feeling. He was in it now. He'd go anywhere with her. He gave her a hug and removed himself quickly and nodded. She turned towards the entrance and they ran. Almost immediately they knew something was wrong with their plan. The iron gates, which would have been used to keep attackers out of the dome, were swung shut. As they got closer, they could see multiple chains were wrapped around the middle part, and makeshift metal defenses propped against the other side of the gate. Still closer yet, they heard shouts from both sides. The humans who had seen them, and gnomish voices from behind the barricades. 2 crossbow bolts whistled by their heads from behind the gate, and they yelped in surprise. It was dawning on Keppo what a grave mistake this had been. The dozen or so humans who had seen them and began to give chase stopped and held their ground, waiting out of accurate range of the crossbows, jeering and taunting all runners and cowards. At the gate, Potencia grasped the fence, afraid for the first time in her life. "Let us in! They're after us!" she demanded. A gnome miner poked his permanently dirty face through a gap to get a better look. A queer countenance, almost of pleasure, flitted on the muscles by his mouth before he turned away and spoke in Gnomish to someone else nearby. The more serious face of an artisan took the place where the dirty one had been. "The orders are the gates don't open," the gnome said, a vague hint of compassion for their predicament, but not much. "They'll kill us! We came here to warn you!" Potencia gasped. There were hushed snickers behind the ramshackle blockade. "Clearly they didn't need to be warned," Keppo said under his breath. "You have to let us in, you just have to," Potencia cried. "Look," the gnome armorer cleared his throat, "it's regrettable that the plan was not properly conveyed to you. We assumed you would be properly envisioned in your homes." The use of the word properly twice in Gnomish elicited another giggle. Another voice spoke up behind. "They say the human metabolism means they'll be starving in a week." Yet another voice said, "Take 'em out one by one in the night." Keppo protested. "We didn't know. Couldn't you open this just a little? We'll be inside before the humans charge, and you've got your bolts and crossbows. Through these holes, they'll be easy pickings." "You must understand what you're asking us to risk. These gates do not move easily, and they will see us removing the chains." "I'm sorry," the armorer said with a punctuated formality. Potencia looked at Keppo in despair. With one final plea, she tried telling the working gnomes who she was, an Iondine. "I believe you, miss, though I'm sorry I never got the chance to meet thee." Again, the formal word usage in Gnomish got another snicker. "I would have thought you'd known. You have your ways of protecting yours, and we have our ways of protecting ours." "Well, what's the Ionid difference?" Potencia threw out her arms in both directions, as if to suggest everything had always belonged to all gnomes. She was met with a blank stare, and though she resented it, she knew deep in her gut the look was deserved. Potencia turned her back to the gate, like Keppo had done some time before, trying to run through their options of what to do next. They stood that way in a standoff as more humans joined the crowd. The humans seemed to find it amusing. "Don't they have anything better to do?" Keppo muttered, a strange form of indignation, like time itself only happened because of the doings of beings. Being in a standoff was in limbo of time, which the humans seemed oddly at peace with, comfortable, which was the opposite of Keppo's regular perception of them. In fact, probably the only reason humans and gnomes got along at all was their shared obsession with industry. The humans seemed to be floating between two worlds, perfectly satisfied to gently sway from one foot to the other. Potencia was shaking. Her shivering was so visible, Keppo grabbed her by the shoulder and pulled her close to him. This was not how he'd expected to die. Still, he found a reserve of courage having his love by his side. He'd waited a long time to live the life he honestly wanted to live, and now was the time to prove it. How? Was still yet to be seen, but for the moment he could hold her close without anyone judging him for doing so. He heard a psst, and some gnome tried passing him a knife between the gaps, but Keppo looked back and refused. Through the now sizable crowd of humans, one stepped between the others, making his way to the front of the group. Although it took him a moment, Keppo recognized the human as Falcior's primary protector, the guard with the thin mustache. Keppo didn't know what he was calmly doing with these other rebels, but, at the very least, he knew the guard would recognize him. "I know him," Keppo said in his calmest voice. "We should surrender. He'll spare our lives." Potentia said nothing, and finally Keppo had to urge her to walk, lightly pressing against her back. After more gentle coercing, she began to walk. They were given a solemn whistle of good luck from the gnomes behind the gate, a whistle given in the mines for explorers in dark places. As they got near, Keppo held up his free hand. "We surrender." One of the humans laughed. "No shit." The guard with the thin mustache said nothing at first. His loyalties had switched gears. These past few years, Falcior had taken him for granted, and had never delivered on the promises to get him some real power of his own. This was a confusing juncture, as he shared long looks with Keppo. On the one hand, taking political prisoners of this caliber would definitely be a power play. On the other, it would show some type of deference to the old power structure they were in the middle of upending, and maybe he should let chaos take its course. The second option felt less like what a leader would do, so he decided to voice his opinion. "These will be good prisoners. We should take them alive." "And what makes them good?" another human scoffed. The swordsman, with the thin mustache, pointed at Keppo. "That one invented a theramite." Chapter: The Dangers of a Ready-Made World. Francis was putting together his pack, trying to use the only light he had, the lamplight from the hall. Lighting said lamp had been hard enough, let alone trying to find another which wasn't bolted to the wall. It didn't matter much. He could do most of his packing by touch. He double-checked and caressed the smooth surface of his ironwood kettle. From the small table, he grabbed all his ingredients and tinctures, hoping the caps were on. He even said that word in his head, hope, and chastised himself for using it. Hope was like fun. If you needed the word to manifest, you could be certain the opposite would happen. Having hope was pouting in advance. He wished the caps on. At least the word wishing had a hint of the magical. Already he could feel a twinge of melancholy about leaving Popheme. Already he felt regret for the words he'd spoken as he was leaving. An unnecessary little attack, a reflex, like an ornery stallion kicking the air to feel better. Already he was romanticizing how lovely she was, even just lounging in her robe. All of Francis's sexual relationships had been short-lived. In young adulthood, he'd outright paid for sex. Slightly later, he learned one always paid in different ways. He was jaded about love. He'd fallen in love with a girl when he was 16, and she'd broken it off with him, and ever since he had the notion that one could know they were in love and still be wrong. It would take him much more time, much more study to understand the world and the people in it. There had been many, many lonely nights. Though the loneliness had gone away, almost completely. He couldn't pinpoint exactly when the change had occurred. Thinking about it now, maybe it was around when he'd started on the quest of transmogrification. He had the goal to guide him. Was that all it was? Having a goal? That idea scared him as much as anything, but he shook it off. No, the loneliness would never be the same as it was, even without the goal. All kinds of people, everyone, probably, had goals of dubious merit. Francis was then thinking about the lonely days of his youth when he imagined being in the thick froth of the high echelons of human power and doings. Now that he had been in those doings, being alone again sounded wonderful. There really was no worse feeling than being lonely in a crowded room. Still, the image of Pophiem's naked body drifted through his consciousness, and he knew he'd never quite be able to shake her. Maybe that's what people were always jabbering about when they talked about witchcraft. Francis cautiously opened the front door to the street. He could hear shouts, but saw no one. He vaguely remembered the weird zigzaggy route he'd walked with Spliff to get to the Theramite machine. Just follow the wires. He cinched the leather strap around his chest to secure his pack and walked, excited now to get back in the woods. The air inside the dome was piped in from outside, but it still didn't have the crisp freshness of real outside or forest air. He was imagining a big, deep breath of delicious forest air. His shoulder didn't hurt any more or less with the pack, and so Francis knew he would be all right. Taking the second turn down a small alley, his concerns were falling away like dead leaves. These were all just the problems of society, the dangers of a ready-made world, one where people were trying to insert themselves and told they could fail or succeed. Success was far stranger than mere society, being made or not made. Success was simply the things which could exist. These were not personal successes. If they were possible, they would simply happen at some point in cosmic time, like his transformation. Oh, now how to be a mole, dig his way straight out of the mountain. Why did his mind go to mole? Why not sparrow? He was smiling to himself again, the distinct possibility of happiness. Then he was at the area of remembrance. There were corpses, scattered, like shadows for why the place existed. These must have been from an earlier confrontation, Francis thought, as he considered the best course of action, now needing to get across ground with no good cover. He could crawl and dash between memorial stones, but he saw no antagonists. He began walking slowly, then stopped, hearing an odd noise, like drops of rain falling from the ceiling or little pebbles being flicked one by one at one of the stones. Francis crept forward, trying to locate the sound. He felt scared of all kinds of things, and nothing. The recent injury and thoughts on suffering made him feel numbed to the idea of death. But he still didn't want anything to interrupt the possibility of happiness, so he stayed patient, each footfall purposeful. What he saw, then, at a good pace away, was exactly what the sound had seemed. A solitary human, his back against a stone, tossing pebbles at a carved monument, a sword lying next to him. What now? Francis had frozen solid. With the simple turn of the head, he would be seen. Should he creep back the way he came? Take the long way around? Yes, probably. But something about the absent and lonely look on the man's face gave Francis a jolt of empathy. Or if not empathy, then the curiosity for a different kind of plan. One with more information than he had currently. And Francis had a vague feeling he had seen this man before. His clothes were not like the goons who had attacked him in the hall. Francis was fairly sure this man was one of Falsior's guard. What was he doing out here? Francis followed his gut. He held up his hands and began walking towards the man. He chirped a short greeting, and the man looked at him wildly and grasped for his sword. Seeing the Druid and his wild beard, with his hands in the air, quickly made him relax, and his face returned to its melancholic slouch. He didn't even stand. Francis now expected the worst, whatever that was. He walked over and took off his pack and sat down against a rock monument a couple yards away. So, no fighting for you then, Francis said. Oh, I've fought plenty, the man with the sad eyes responded. Might as well get to the point, Francis thought. Why are you here? The man picked up another handful of pebbles and started tossing them against the opposite rock. Where am I supposed to be? Then he half muttered to himself, Ask myself that question more times than I can count. I'm not pressuring you, friend. I'm just surprised. I haven't seen much of anything the past few days. The man looked Francis over, slowly, pack and all. Well, if you're trying to leave, I wouldn't get my hopes up. Why's that? Francis asked. They've blocked the gate. They mean to starve us out. Last summer I said it was going to be my last. I didn't sign up for this shit. He threw a whole handful of pebbles at the stone. Francis was beginning to catch on. The only question was, did he take this man's word? To see for himself or not to see for himself? That was the question. No, there was no question. There was no reason for the man to lie. Francis cursed. The adrenaline and happiness fading, Francis's shoulders started to feel sore. He needed medicines. He searched in his pack and found a couple viable options. He picked up the distillation of hemlock and elderberry, numbing without the psychotropic effects. He looked at the vial, then towards the sad man, and tossed him the vial. Take the edge off. Without thinking, without a single secondary thought interrupting the motions of his hands, the man took out the small cork and drained the whole thing, with Francis shaking a hand. No, wait. Francis sighed under his breath. We were meant to share it. He picked out a vial of his second option, wormwood sap, wild rice mold, and ash root. The first option had been distilled to eliminate psychotropic effects. This potion was not. In more pleasant circumstance, this was part of the pleasure and welcomed. But what was to welcome anything? Only in the best circumstances, when things were going perfectly? That situation had no name because it didn't exist. Francis drank half the potion, saving some for later and to wait and see what half did to him in his current state. He thought about graveyards. He'd never been in one quite like this one. The simplicity paired with intricate attention to detail was very moving and beautiful. The potion coming on fast, Francis thought this would actually be a very remarkable place to be remembered. He'd always imagined, at the end, sitting under a big beautiful tree, but this place would be all right too. He looked up at the dome, twinkling now and then with the rays of light breaking through the morning clouds. He'd missed graveyards. As a young man, he'd been very attracted to them. Why was that? Partially, it must have been his penchant for being alone. Most normal people felt morose in places like this, so they stayed away until the occasions were unavoidable. Solitude, peace. Those were two reasons, but there must have been another. Something about memory. Most remembered for nothing more than their name. It was comforting, the grand ambivalence. One could pretend to make meaning in one's head as much as one wanted. Still, ultimately, there was none. It was all made up. The best you could do was make life beautiful. And even still, in a graveyard, everyone was equal. A big, beautiful monument held as much interest as a small and humble one. That is, no interest. Not really. In a graveyard, one is solipsistic. Even a little haughty. Not yet, motherfuckers. Not yet. A good place to die, a graveyard, the man said to Francis, interrupting his thoughts and strangely mimicking them. The potion obviously working, expanding thought into the environment. No more pebble throwing. The man's head was resting against stone. Doubt they'll give us a headstone for just sitting here, though, Francis joked. That's true, the man said, as if just realizing he was only sitting. We could put the bodies somewhere, Francis said, mentioning the dead, trying to be practical and helpful to overcome the potential feelings of dread and apathy. Don't think they'd give us a headstone for that, either. There was a question about what to do. Should he go back to Pophine's room? It would seem as if she'd be obligated to protect him, even if only in her own meager way, a cup of tea and a piece of furniture to sleep on, but he dismissed this idea quickly. The possibility of her resentment and frustration too obvious. And he wasn't entirely sure she had any interest in his well-being. Then again, there was the question about what he could do for her. He did want to see her alive. He stood and began wandering between the dead bodies, looking for clues and ideas. It seemed as if the weapons had already been scavenged. He'd never been trained with a sword and barely noticed their absence. He picked through the pockets of a dead gnome and found a green rock, rubbed smooth between fingers. A lucky rock. Well, an unlucky one. He walked it over to the man who was loosening the buttons on his leather vest. Francis tossed him the emerald. "What's your name?" Francis asked in this place of names. It seemed obvious he was going to need a friend. "Mikhail," the man responded, observing the emerald closely. "What will they do when they found you've deserted, Mikhail?" "Let them think whatever they want." Man by my own heart. How would one change a thought? In his mind, Francis was thinking very literally, as if a sentence might be clay within the brain. Oh, what was he saying? Thoughts were changed all the time. Every new thought was capable of change. The problem was, like clay, most people put their thoughts in the kiln right away. Almost as soon as they sprang into existence, they were hard as rock. The more beautiful thoughts took time to be massaged and molded and have other thoughts added onto them, and then maybe stuck in the kiln. When they'd been out in the sun long enough, they were going to harden anyway. Oof, this tincture was starting to make him daydreamy. He noticed he was swaying, standing up. Then they heard a cheer coming from the direction of the marketplace. Something had happened. Something was always happening, Francis thought, the phrase sounding 10 times more profound with the medicine in his blood. Should we go see? Francis was part of a we now and was not going to act alone, at least not until he sobered up. Numbed, the mercenary named Mikhail stood and said with an inflection attempting humor, "I think these stones will keep." With their hands bound behind their backs and half sitting, half balancing on a barrel, they couldn't relax. Potentia and Keppo awaited their fate, trying to make sure the barrel didn't roll out from under them. The marketplace had become the de facto gathering point for humans, and there was a general anxiety about what to do next. In dramatic fashion, Calumny emerged from behind the canvas wall of a closed tent, to many of the rebels' surprise. They had been loose in their own Atheramite worlds. The goons cheered the return of Vision. Calumny had been inside the tent conferring with Falcior and his guard with a thin mustache, now named General. The meeting had Calumny feeling good, keeping Falcior on a leash. Even Falcior's loyalists were now looking to Calumny for direction. His new general barely even looked at Falcior as they talked plans. Calumny held up a fist and addressed the human mob. "We have fought our way to the precipice, and looking over it is obvious who the true enemies are." Calumny directed the mob's attention to the barricaded gate. "They would starve and kill us all. They do not care what happens to us. Never did. Their mistake was underestimating us. Do we think those gates can stop us?" There was a garbled cheer of "No" from the growling humans. "All our work, all those years where our backs ached, our feet hurt, when you couldn't even get it up for a whore?" Calumny waited for the chuckles. "All our work has been for this moment, and they think a gate can stop us? Nothing can stop us now. These gnomes don't stand a chance against the human physique. We will squash them under our boots. Not out of hatred, out of pity. Like a dog who cannot stop disobeying its master. Our bloodline deserves this mountain, and if they cannot share it, well, that shows how simple-minded they are." The mob grunted approvals. "But first we must acknowledge the gifts they have given us. For one, time. We can fortify this dome and clear out all the rats." Calumny pointed at the 2 bound gnomes on the barrel. "We will break into groups, like shifts in the mines, and go door to door. We will bring the rats here. If they do not cooperate, they will be killed. We will use them as shields when we are ready to attack the gate. Gather all food you find. Any riches can be kept for yourselves. Property will be distributed after. This may take days, but look around you. You've already won." Calumny held out his arms and beamed, the constellation-like scars on his face twinkling. "Now go, door to door." Calumny turned to his new general. "And what more do you think I can get from these prisoners?" General Thin Mustache replied, "Perhaps they know of any traps." Calumny thought about this, but he was so pleased with himself thinking of the universe's subservience to his will, he had to look at Falcior, the man who couldn't. Calumny walked up to him, shoulder to shoulder, and gloated silently. Falcior looked dejected. He was lost. Leering over to see the look on his face was delicious. Today was actually better than all of Calumny's expectations. He'd already won. Basking in this internal light for another minute, he finally turned his attention to Potentia and Keppo. I hear one of you found our magic rocks in the shaft I sweated years of my life away in. It means nothing to me, you should know. Neither gnome knew how to respond. They stared back nervously. What makes a gnome powerful? Calumny asked his new general. Social standing, parties, coin, mostly, the general replied. You know, it's always surprised me what you can get people to do for coin, and yet they never do the most important things. No coin can give you a vision of the future. Shall I tell you, little gnomes, what power actually is? Both were too frightened to speak. It's light. He held his hand up to the dome. Help me get you back into the light. No one deserves to spend their life underground. Keppo was taken aback by this high-roading attitude and inflection in Calumny's voice. Then, suddenly, a dark cloud rolled over the dome and Calumny's mood changed. Help us or die. He took his knife out of its holster and held it loosely balanced on the top of Potentia's skull between two fingers, the tip cutting into her skin. Keppo couldn't give up his children or wife, but he didn't know what else to give. His mind was spinning. He looked frantically to Falcior, who could only widen his eyes and shake his head apathetically. We'll get them to open the gate, Keppo yelled. You didn't before, the general said skeptically. We can gather the rest of the council. And where are they? Keppo didn't say anything to this question. Potentia couldn't seem to keep a thought together. The only thing in her mind was running, scurry under a merchant's table and roll out the back of a tent, but the knife's weight on her skull made her whole body shiver, and she doubted if she could speak coherently, let alone move. Then something hit Calumny's back. He took full hold of the knife and turned. Whatever hit him had been small. He saw no movement, then looked at the ground, where an emerald shone distinctly in a crack between paved stones. Calumny picked up the emerald, examined it, and put it in his pocket. Returning his thoughts to the gnomes seemed too much bother. Throw 'em in a barrel. We'll see if we can use 'em later. The new general motioned to one of his friends in the guard who was standing by, and they picked up the gnomes and found another barrel. Jogging away from the market, Francis asked Mikhail between heavy breaths, Why did you throw it? Bad luck to hold another man's lucky charm, and he could use some bad luck, Mikhail replied matter-of-factly. Francis smiled. An interesting battle tactic. Most wished for their own fates, the glory of their own deeds. But perhaps one only need wait. There was just as much bad luck in the world as good luck. The thought made him like Mikhail much more. The idea of waiting appealed to him on a personal level. Waiting for bad conscience to finally take hold and self-destruct. Bad luck did come to those who deserved it. Francis wondered if he was a coward thinking this way, knowing bad luck also came to those who didn't deserve it. His self-doubt could only be resolved by patting for the vial in the breast pocket of his tunic and drinking down the second half. Back in the graveyard, Mikhail sat against a stone, repeating his previous position almost exactly. Francis looked over the dead human revels, and the same line he'd recalled in Pophine's room passed in front of his eyes. Only the opposite is appropriate for the shame of a god.